New York never sleeps, and this evening was no exception. One of the city's most prestigious business centers was hosting a high-profile charity event that brought together politicians, owners of major corporations, celebrities, and the elite of society. The evening was organized on a grand scale. A huge hall shone with luxury, tables were laden with exquisite dishes, and guests in elegant attire discussed business, politics, and the latest news. It was clear from the start that the journalists' attention was focused on one person, Melania Trump. As soon as she entered the room, cameras immediately turned in her direction, and reporters immediately began to take up positions to ask her questions. No matter how hard she tried to keep a low profile, she was impossible to ignore. Her elegant dress, impeccable style, and reserved smile made her the center of the evening. Journalists knew that she rarely gave interviews, but since such an opportunity presented itself, they could not pass up the chance to ask her questions, especially about her husband, Donald Trump. Melania, accustomed to constant attention, held herself calmly and with dignity, showing no irritation. She gracefully raised her glass of champagne, politely conversed with the guests, and only occasionally glanced in the direction of the crowd of journalists. "Mrs. Trump, what are your impressions of today's event?" asked the first question from one of the reporters who had managed to get closer to her than the others. She turned to him and, still smiling, replied, "I always support charitable initiatives. Such evenings are important because they remind us that the world needs good deeds." There were other questions, not too difficult, quite predictable, and Melania answered them with her usual diplomacy. But even in this light tone, there was a certain line that should not be crossed. She was polite, but made it clear that this was not an interview and that she had no desire to discuss personal matters. Among the many journalists, one stood out. His name was Eric Howard, and he was known for his tough questions and liberal views. He never missed a chance to take a jab at Republicans, especially Donald Trump. And today, his wife was clearly his target. Howard watched Melania answer questions carefully, waiting for the right moment. He knew other reporters wouldn't ask about politics, wouldn't get personal. But he wasn't going to do the same. When the flow of ordinary questions began to dry up, he stepped forward and, slightly raising the microphone, said loudly, "Mrs. Trump, don't you think that being the wife of a man like Donald Trump is not the easiest fate?" The room quieted down a bit. It was clear that some reporters were tense, realizing that something unusual was about to happen. Melania was not embarrassed. She turned to the journalist, paused briefly, and replied, "Being the wife of the president is always a responsibility, no matter who we are talking about." But Howard clearly had no intention of stopping. He felt that his first attempt had not produced the desired effect, and decided to continue. "However, your husband is a rather controversial figure. Don't you feel that you often have to defend him, even when you don't like it?" One of the guests glanced quickly at Melania. Everyone understood that this question was a provocation. But she remained unperturbed. She bowed her head and replied, "I always support my family. It is the most important thing in life." The answer was perfectly calibrated, but Howard was not about to back down. "How do you feel about the fact that your husband is constantly criticized? Doesn't it bother you?" "My husband is a strong man," Melania said calmly. "He knows what he's doing." The journalist grinned. He saw that her answers were impeccable, but he wanted more. "And you? Are you strong too? Or do you have to endure all this because you simply have no choice?" There was silence in the hall. Some of the guests began to feel uneasy, but Melania kept her cool. "I always do what I think is right," she said with a slight smile. "And I don't have to endure anything." Howard wasn't happy. He expected her to snap, to lose her cool, to say something that could be used against her. But she held her own. However, one person in the room could no longer calmly watch what was happening. At the back of the room, at a table with glasses of champagne, stood a young man. He watched all this and clenched his fists more and more. It was Barron Trump. He hadn't intended to interfere, but now he saw that this journalist had crossed the line. He saw the expression on his mother's face, her calm, her restraint. But he also saw that she was tired of these questions. And he wasn't going to let it continue. Barron took a deep breath, took a few steps forward, and moved straight towards the journalist. At that moment, he did not yet know that his action would become the main event of the evening. The room continued to buzz with conversation. The guests at the charity event discussed business, exchanged business cards, joked, raised champagne glasses, and enjoyed an atmosphere that combined luxury with formal politeness. But the focus remained on Melania Trump. She had become accustomed to the fact that wherever she went, cameras and microphones followed her. She carried herself impeccably, with the grace that had always distinguished her among America's first ladies. The journalists did not waste a second. They asked questions, at first easy, general ones, not requiring complex answers. "Mrs. Trump, tell us, what is your main motivation for participating in such events?" "Helping others is an important mission for all of us," she answered with a slight smile. "How do you evaluate the work of the charitable foundations that are represented here today?" "I believe that every person who strives to change the world for the better deserves respect," she answered calmly, measuredly, but there was no coldness or detachment in her voice. On the contrary, dignity sounded in each of her phrases, and this once again reminded the journalists that their attempts to find a sensation among her words would be futile. But among them was one who came here with a completely different purpose. Eric Howard, a journalist with a well-known liberal reputation, stood in the crowd of colleagues, holding a microphone. He waited patiently for the moment to ask his question. He knew he would only have one chance, but it would have to be enough. When he saw that the stream of harmless questions was beginning to dry up, he stepped forward, raised the microphone, and said loudly, "Mrs. Trump, tell me honestly, is it hard to be Donald Trump's wife?" The question sounded unexpectedly harsh. Some of the journalists looked at each other, and some even smiled, realizing that the evening had just taken a new turn. But Melania didn't show that she was offended. She turned smoothly towards the journalist, looked at him with a slight smile, and calmly answered, "I am lucky to be the wife of a man I respect." It was the perfect answer, but Howard wasn't about to back down. "But your husband is an extremely controversial figure, doesn't that bother you?" he asked with a slight hint of sarcasm in his voice. The hall fell silent again. Everyone knew that such questions were not just curiosity, but a deliberate provocation. Melania, without changing her expression, only slightly bowed her head and answered, "Any person who makes important decisions always causes controversy. It is inevitable." Howard smiled, but not because he was satisfied with the answer. On the contrary, his smile betrayed disappointment. He expected Melania to be at least a little confused, that he would be able to provoke her into emotion. But she held herself firmly, as if she had long been preparing for such an attack. Then he decided to approach it from a different angle. "You say you respect him. Does it bother you that many people consider him one of the most controversial presidents?" She shook her head slightly. "Being president means making decisions that not everyone likes. It's part of the job. And the fact that your marriage is so often discussed in the press, is that also part of the job?" After these words, an awkward silence fell in the hall. Even other journalists felt the question had gone beyond the pale. Melania took a slow breath, but her expression did not change. "My marriage is my personal life," she said firmly. "And you are here, as I understand, to cover a charity event? Or do you have another goal?" Howard pretended not to hear the last question and continued his attack. "Doesn't it irritate you that you are constantly compared to former first ladies?" Melania didn't flinch again. "Every person is unique. I have never tried to be like anyone else. But you are called the most closed first lady in history. Don't you have anything to say to people?" Some journalists gasped quietly. This was no longer an interview, it was an attack. Melania paused and then replied, "Are you here to ask questions or to judge?" The hall fell silent again. Howard realized that his attack was starting to falter. He saw that Melania was holding herself firmly, but he also saw a slight weariness in her eyes. This is exactly what he was trying to achieve. And he was pleased with himself. Some of the guests in the room began to feel uneasy. Journalists are used to the fact that Trump always responded harshly to provocations, but Melania behaved differently. She did not allow herself to make sharp attacks, did not resort to personal attacks, but it was obvious that she was not pleased. But no one expected that at that moment the situation would change dramatically. Howard was about to ask another question, but suddenly he felt someone grab his arm. He turned around abruptly. Barron Trump stood before him. A deathly silence reigned in the hall. He looked calm, but there was determination in his eyes. "If you have any more provocative questions, ask them to me." His voice was firm, confident, without hesitation. The journalist was taken aback for a second. He didn't expect Barron to intervene. And even more so, he did not expect that the young man would look at him as if he could see right through him. At that moment it became clear, the evening was taking a completely different turn. When Howard felt a firm grip on his wrist, he instinctively jerked away, but the grip did not loosen. The journalist quickly turned his head and found himself looking into the serious, cold gaze of Barron Trump. Silence immediately fell around. It seemed that even the flashes of cameras froze for a moment. The guests of the evening, who had been watching with curiosity yet another fight between journalists and a public figure, were now stunned. No one expected Barron to intervene in the situation. The guy looked completely calm, but there was determination in his eyes. He wasn't angry, he wasn't shouting, he didn't look irritated. He just looked straight into the journalist's face, his lips pressed together, his posture straight. There was something special about that look, something that made even the most experienced reporters feel a slight tremor inside. "If you have any more provocative questions, ask them to me," Barron said, enunciating each word clearly. His voice sounded calm but confident. Howard blinked slowly, trying to come to terms with the sudden situation. "What?" he muttered, trying to understand what was happening. His usual self-assurance wavered. He was used to dominating interviews, challenging politicians, but he was not prepared for his interlocutor to be a young man who looked at him with the same confidence as his father. Some of the reporters shifted nervously in their seats. They were used to Barron in the shadows. He rarely appeared in public, much less intervened in such conversations. But today everything was different. Barron didn't let go of the reporter's hand right away. He waited a couple of long seconds before doing so. He didn't want to hurt him, he just wanted him to understand that he wouldn't let anyone humiliate his mother. When Howard was finally able to move, he took a small step back, trying to maintain what remained of his dignity. "The president's son standing up for him? How unexpected," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. Barron didn't look away. "I stand up for my mother." After these words, the first applause was heard in the hall. Some of the guests nodded, some felt respect for the young man who was not afraid to step forward and do what many would have thought impossible. Howard felt like he was losing. He glanced around quickly, trying to figure out if he had a chance to turn the situation around. He saw the cameras trained on him, saw the reporters waiting for his reaction. But he didn't find the right answer. Barron did not continue the conflict. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't get personal, he just defended his mother, letting her know that he was there. Melania cast a glance at her son that was filled with pride. She was used to being on her own, used to not asking for protection, but at that moment she realized she had someone who would always stand by her side. Howard knew that if he continued to press, he would lose his reputation forever. He didn't want to be remembered as the man who got into an argument with the president's son and ended up being defeated not by words, but by a simple fact: respect for his mother. He pressed his lips together, turned around, and walked away without saying another word. As soon as the journalists retreated, a loud storm of applause erupted from the hall. The guests, who had at first simply watched, now did not hide their admiration. People raised their glasses, some nodded to Barron with approval, others quietly discussed what had happened. "A real gentleman," one of the guests heard the voice of one of the ladies standing nearby. "He's just like his father," someone else added. Barron was not embarrassed, but he did not try to bask in the glory either. He simply walked up to his mother and stood silently next to her, showing that he was here, he was close, and he would always be her support. Melania smiled, her eyes shining a little warmer in the light of the chandeliers. "Thank you, son," she said quietly, placing her hand on his shoulder. Barron only nodded slightly. He didn't do anything special for himself, but he did something important for his mother. And at that moment he realized, no matter who his father was, he himself chooses his own path, the path of a man who is not afraid to stand up for the truth. Journalists began writing about it within a few minutes. Barron Trump stood up for his mother at a charity event. Unexpected intervention by the president's son, young Trump puts journalist in his place. Barron's manly act. He was not afraid to protect his family. Twitter filled with comments, and videos from the moment of the conflict spread across social networks, gaining millions of views. Barron himself wasn't looking for attention, he just did what he thought was right. But the world has already noticed him. And from that evening onwards, he was no longer just the president's youngest son. He became an independent figure. And perhaps this evening was just the beginning of something bigger. Howard stood there, his lips pressed together, searching Barron's face, but he couldn't say anything. The situation he considered to be to his advantage had suddenly turned against him. He had come to the party expecting to catch Melania in some careless remark, but now he was the center of attention for an entirely different reason. It seemed as if even the walls of the hall had absorbed the silence that hung in the air. People held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Barron kept his gaze fixed on her, his posture perfectly straight, his face calm and collected. This was not a rash gesture, not a teenage attempt to attract attention. This was a clear understanding of what he had to do. Howard felt like he was losing control. "I asked your mother questions, Barron." He tried to get out of the situation. "You understand that this is part of her role, she is a public figure? And I understand that every person has boundaries that cannot be crossed." Barron answered with the same calm confidence. Howard glanced around nervously. Some of his fellow reporters were looking at him with discomfort, others with amused interest, clearly enjoying the way he was cornered. "Are you really saying that I can't be asked uncomfortable questions?" he asked, trying to regain at least the remnants of his confidence. Barron nodded slowly. "No, you can ask questions. But you can't act as if my mother is not a person." The journalist was at a loss for a moment. The hall became animated again, conversations began, and someone in the crowd nodded in agreement. Barron continued, "You didn't come here to find out the truth, but to humiliate. But not this time." Howard felt his insides tighten. He knew that if he persisted, he would only make things worse. If he said something too harsh, he would be known as the man who attacked a teenager defending his mother. And if he walked away, he would lose. But the worst thing was that he had already lost. Someone in the crowd quietly laughed, someone nodded approvingly at Barron. Howard exhaled. "Okay," he said and put the microphone away. He quickly turned around, not waiting for anyone to say anything else, and headed away from the crowd. Barron didn't follow him with his eyes, he simply remained standing next to his mother, making it clear that the situation was over. The journalists watched in silence as Howard disappeared among the guests, some even turning away to avoid meeting his gaze. It wasn't just a loss, it was a public defeat. As soon as Howard disappeared from the hall, the first applause sounded. First a few people, then dozens, and now the entire hall is loudly clapping their hands. Barron sighed slightly, but his expression did not change. "Young man, that was worthy," said one of the businessmen. "Aren't you afraid to be so honest?" asked one of the guests. Barron didn't lose his composure. "I just told the truth." Melania, standing next to him, smiled faintly. She hadn't expected her son to handle the situation so confidently, but at the same time she was proud of him. She put her hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "You did great." Barron nodded only slightly. For him, it wasn't a show or a way to get attention. He just did what he had to do. But this moment has already become a story that will be discussed all evening and perhaps even for several weeks. The applause was still ringing out in the room, but Barron wasn't responding to it the way many expected. He wasn't smiling, nodding in gratitude, enjoying the moment of triumph. He simply stood next to his mother, his posture straight, his gaze calm and focused. For him, this wasn't a victory, it wasn't something to celebrate. He had done what he had to do, protect his mother, and that was what mattered most to him. Melania gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze, letting him know she was proud of him. She said nothing, but no words were needed. This moment belonged to both of them, mother and son, who, despite the constant media attention and gossip, always remained close to each other. That evening, the world saw that Barron Trump was not just the son of a president, he was a person who could stand up for his loved ones. The journalists began to chatter, their cameras trained on Barron and Melania, and the headlines that would be broadcast across the country tomorrow were already appearing on their phones and tablets. Barron Trump puts reporter in his place, the president's son shows strength of character, unexpected moment at a charity event, Barron defends Melania. But he himself was not thinking about this. He understood that by the morning this episode would be surrounded by many interpretations, that someone would admire him, and someone would accuse him of wanting to attract attention, but none of this mattered. What mattered was that his mother no longer had to endure unpleasant questions and humiliating innuendo. The guests began to leave, some approached Barron, shook his hand, some simply nodded, expressing their respect. One of the businessmen even jokingly remarked, "If you ever decide to go into politics, you already have style." Barron only chuckled in response, but said nothing. He was not going to participate in these conversations, he was not going to play a role. For him, all this was too noisy, too overloaded with emotion. When the attention of the journalists waned a little, he turned to his mother and said quietly, "Let's get out of here." Melania, realizing that he was tired of the increased attention, nodded. Together they headed for the exit, moving past the guests, past people who were not yet finished discussing what had happened. Barron felt the eyes on him, heard the whispers, but he paid no attention to them. When they stepped outside, the air was cool but pleasant after the heat of the room. The car was already waiting at the entrance, and the security guards were standing a little distance away, observing the surroundings. Barron took a deep breath and for the first time all evening allowed himself to relax a little. Melania turned to him and said, "Do you realize that everyone will be talking about this tomorrow?" Barron nodded. "I know. But I don't care." She chuckled, a warm look in her eyes. "You've become very mature." He shrugged, but didn't answer. As they got into the car, he looked out the window, watching the crowd of reporters still standing outside, some calling, some texting, some still discussing what had happened. This would be a night to remember. But it didn't matter to him. He hadn't done anything for the fame, for the cameras, for the headlines. He had simply protected his mother. And that was enough.